My first encounter with Rosalyn Tureck was on October 24th, 1966. And the reason I remember this is I still have the program for the recital that she gave at Princeton University during my freshman year. And voila, I brought it with me. My first real encounter with Rosalyn took place 3 years later. I was already doing classical radio shows on WPRB Princeton, and Rosalyn fascinated me because one of my first records was one of Rosalyn's records, her recording on Allegro of the Ouverture à la manière française, the, if you will, the companion to the concerto according to the Italian taste in Klavierübung Volume 2. But in those days, I was a purist. And here was this indomitable lady proselytizing at a time when it was already beginning to be unfashionable, if not solidly unfashionable, Bach on the piano. So I said to myself, the best way to deal with this is to find out if Rosalyn Tureck will agree to sit for an interview for my show on WPRB. I wrote a letter to her in care of Cami. I got relatively quick response, all things being equal, because it was July when I wrote to her, and she was most agreeable to it, but we had to go to her. She couldn't come to Princeton. Fine. A member of the Princeton faculty with whom I was friendly, a wonderful professor of electrical engineering named Foreman Acton, who was musically inclined, said, "Not a problem, Terry, I'll drive you up to Pound Ridge," because Rosalyn still had the house in Pound Ridge, Shagan Noor. I can see her now. We arrived at the appointed time. I rang the doorbell. Rosalyn came to the door. She was wearing a canary yellow velvet house dress that went right to the floor. Her hair was totally in disarray, and she said, "Oh, good, you're here, just in time to help me pick curtain material." So before we sat down to do the interview, Foreman and I communed with her about some patterns for some curtain material because she needed some new curtains for one of the rooms at Shagan Noor, it was a wonderful glass house. It was on 5 acres of property, of which 4¼ acres were a lake. So that was the beginning, and set up the tape recorder, started the interview, and I have to say, within 5 minutes, the Methodist minister's grandson and the daughter of Turkish Jews knew we were going to be thick as thieves, and we were from then on. It was within the scope of that interview, she and I became close friends. It was absolutely marvelous. It is something, a memory I will treasure for all of my life. Rosalyn asked no more of anybody else than she asked of herself. As anyone who knew her well will tell you, she could have had 100 people working for her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and she still would have had more for them to do. That was just the way she was built. She was committed, she was, if you will, driven. But she always said please, she always said thank you. And she took tremendous joy in the relationships that were close to her, the people that she bonded with, to use, if you will, a trendy expression. And I think that's basically the best way I can describe Rosalyn as a person. And of course, if you will, the sad aspect of that is that it is a side of Rosalyn that the general public never saw from the stage, because as you know, she went out onto the stage, she sat down, she got to the business at hand, and that was her commitment at that given moment. Her commitment was to putting out, for the benefit of the people who had paid to come to hear her, the best possible performance that she could give under the circumstances. And I think this is also one of the reasons why many people think of Rosalyn Tureck as a person who was humorless, and that is absolutely incorrect. No one liked to laugh more than Rosalyn did, and I know this from personal experience because I took her one night to hear Peter Schickele do PDQ Bach. And at one point, Rosalyn was laughing so hard she slipped out of the chair onto the floor. We had to pick her up back into the chair. And after it was over, she said to me, "Teri, I want to go to the green room." And of course, I know Peter. And he'd been a guest on my radio show at WBAI back in the Guten Alten Zeit. So up the stairs we go. This was before they renovated Carnegie Hall. And there are two things that I remember. One was the look of utter shock and terror when Peter saw that Rosalyn Tureck was in the line. And the other was the expression of total relief and total joy when Rosalyn just was effusively over the top at how great the satire was, what all the hidden inner jokes were. And as I said, that part of Rosalyn is something that the average person never saw. And sadly, in the videos, at least that I've seen, it's a part of her that does not sadly bubble to the surface. I have got more than one to share with you. The first, October 10th, 1977. There's a reason why I remember the date. Rosalyn had, and I mean, this was a Tureck tour de force, had scheduled a double performance of the Goldberg Variations in Carnegie Hall. The harpsichord performance began, I think, at 6, then there was a dinner break, and we reconvened, I think, at 8:40. Whatever, I have that information elsewhere. I also have a recording of those performances because Rosalyn not only allowed me to have it pirated, but also she provided the seats. So the problem was that Carnegie Hall, which seats 2,200 people, is much vaster than the kind of room in which a harpsichord usually is played. So she had decided that it needed to be amplified, and a speaker was put. This was as a result of discussions that she and I had. I said, "You can't put the speaker anywhere other than underneath the instrument, so that the sound from the speaker is coming from the same location as the sound from your dowd, your double manual dowd." So Rosalyn asked me to come the day before, which was, the recital was October 11th, on October 10th, so that we could do what we could to make sure that the amplified harpsichord sounded natural, no matter where you were in Carnegie Hall. And Stuart Warkow, bless his heart, who was at the time the manager of Carnegie Hall, was also deputized. Remember, Rosalyn used to say, "Be an angel." And that meant that she had something for you to do. So he and I were running up, down, everywhere in Carnegie Hall. Now it sounds amplified, it sounds disembodied up here, and of course trying to judge it in an empty hall, what it was going to sound like when the hall was full, all of these sorts of things. Well, we spent the better part of 2.5, 3 hours. So we finish everything, we're all satisfied, and Rosalyn turned to me and said, "Teri, disappear for an hour and then come back, please." So I went up to the New York Athletic Club, had a short workout in the gym, and came back. And she said to me, "Teri, dear, take any seat in the hall. I feel like running through them." So I took a seat in the middle of row H. And for an hour and a half, I was Hermann Karl, Count von Keyserlingk, and she was Johann Sebastian Bach. You stop and think about, if you were to try and, if you will, create that situation, and to create it in Carnegie Hall, to hear the Goldberg Variations played one-on-one, the way they were intended originally to be played, and the cost of it Rosalyn Tureck's fee, the rental fee for Carnegie Hall, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it would be mind-boggling. And it was marvelous. And I said to her afterwards, Rosalyn, if only I had had my little dictating machine with me to take it down. She looked at me and smiled and she said, Teri dear, there are some performances that are destined not to be recorded. And there are two other quickies that I'd like to tell. One of them concerns my mother, who never met Rosalyn, but they talked frequently on the telephone. Rosalyn knew, this was obviously in the days before mobile phones were developed. If Rosalyn had lived in the day of the mobile phone, none of us would have been safe from her. She would have found us anywhere we were at, except if we were out of range. Rosalyn knew that if she couldn't find me at the phone numbers that she had, that the one person who would know was my mother, so she'd call the house in Greenwich. And I remember I got off the train one Saturday morning, and my mother was picking me up, and my mother said to me, tell me, did Miss Tureck find you? And I said, yes, she found me last night. So I'm going to see her on Monday. And she looked at me and she said, you know, Miss Tureck said to me that you would do things for her that you wouldn't do for me. Well, I hesitated before I answered, and my mother said, and she said you'd hesitate before you answered that question. Another unforgettable image in my mind is the afternoon that Rosalyn called me and said, busy tonight? I said, no, Rosalyn, why? She said, I feel like going to the movies. I said, what are we seeing? The new documentary about Idi Amin. Oh, she said, yes, dear. It is important that every now and again we remind ourselves that evil can take on many guises. And we went and saw that movie and came out of it, you know, sort of in a semi-state of shock. And she said to me, you see what I mean? I said, I agree with you 100%. And finally, there was the time I took her to see Cats. And here we are in this Andrew Lloyd Webber show. We have a wonderful time watching it, and she's leaning over to me and she said, he stole that from Poulenc. That comes from Shostakovich. That sounds like Rachmaninoff. Well, afterwards, she took me to the theater. I took her over to Barbetta for dinner, and it was late, so the place was basically empty. And Rosalyn and I were sitting in one corner, and in the other corner, there was a young couple. The woman had bleached blonde hair. And I had a big Canon SLR with me, a single lens reflex, which I sort of was playing with. It was on the table. And I saw the man at the table in the other corner gesture for the captain, who was a 6'7" tall chap we called Giovannino, Little John. And Giovannino went over and there was a conversation. The rest of the meal went on, they left. And Giovannino came over to the table and I said to him, I said, Giovannino, what was that man so upset about? And he looked at me and he said, Mr. Towe, didn't you recognize them? I said, no, I had no clue, except she needs to find a good hairdresser. He said, that was Sean Penn and Madonna. And of course, everybody knew at the time that Sean Penn, you know, was trashing paparazzi and all this sort of thing. And I said, oh, Lord, what did you say to them? He said, it was very simple, Mr. Towe. I explained to them that you are one of the restaurant's regular customers, the signorina's lawyer, and that the lady that you were with has been much more famous than Madonna is for many more years. Absolutely unforgettable. Her strongest character trait was total commitment. When she made up her mind that she was going to do something, she did it. And that from the anecdotal history, you know, going to Olga Samarov with another Prelude and Fugue and having memorized it and just putting the music down and playing it. When she set out on a project, it was total, unswerving commitment. There also, which is something a lot of people didn't see, a remarkable warmth in the lady. Generosity, quiet appreciation, quiet support, you know, emotional support when you needed it, that sort of thing. And these things would sometime come together. And one of the ways that manifested itself is, you know, she was a clavichord player, and it's the side of her that the world never heard. And I remember the commitment she'd be working on when she was working on the preludes and fugues from the Well-Tempered Clavier for the series that she did for the BBC in the 70s when she was living on East 68th Street. I remember more than one occasion we'd been out to dinner, and I walked her back to 215 East 68, and she said, "Teri, dear, I feel like playing the clavichord." So I would pull up a chair beside the Goff, and she'd play until 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was the combination of the commitment, because what I realized she was doing was working out issues, interpretive issues, at the clavichord to be prepared to translate them to the piano. And at the same time, she was showing me an ultimate generosity, knowing how much I adored her playing, by letting me be a fly on the wallpaper. The adjective is formidable. The noun is genius. Well, as far as general influence is concerned, it was through Rosalyn that indirectly I met more people in the musical world in New York than through anyone else. We had been to hear George Bollett give a recital in Carnegie Hall, and as you may know, George Bollett, Earl Wilde, and Rosalyn were all classmates together at Juilliard. After this recital of George Bollett's, we went to the green room, and we had greeted Mr. Bollett, and we were standing talking, and a man walked into the room wearing a lavender tuxedo jacket. And Rosalyn looked at me and said, "Teri, you must know Joe Maklis." And she didn't mean in the sense that surely I had met this man. She meant it in the sense that this is someone you need to know. And Joe, of course, who wrote the famous textbook, The Enjoyment of Music, if there was anybody in this world that didn't know Joe, it was their fault, not his. And through Rosalyn, I got to know Joe, and through Joe, I met so many people in the world of music, the world of culture: Hirschfeld, Alger Hiss, Sulema Stravinsky, Stella Adler. The list is endless. And I always attribute this to Rosalyn, because I may have met Joe Maklis in another context, but Rosalyn took me over and said, "Joe, I want you to meet this friend of mine, Teri Towe." And that was the beginning. Musically, Rosalyn expanded my horizons. In the course of that interview that I recorded with her in 1969, in the course of conversations, she opened windows for me. I began to understand why it is. This is something I learned also from Pablo Casals and from William H. Scheide, the founder of the Bach Aria Group, that it is the substance of the performance that is important, not the form that it takes. In other words, if, as Casals in essence would have put it, if the performance is well executed and it moves you, it's good music. If the performance does not move you, no matter how well executed it is and on whatever instrument it is bad music. And Rosalyn was committed to making the best possible music. And also, she expected the listener to meet her on the same level. She didn't just serve them a meal. She expected the listener to meet her on the same level, to invest as much energy and thought and commitment into listening to it as she was putting into making the performance possible. As far as scholarship was concerned, and Rosalyn was every inch a scholar, Rosalyn was fortunate to be a member of the last generation of independent scholars who were tolerated by academia. If you detect a certain amount of sarcasm in that statement, it is deliberate, because I am one generation too young. There are too many people out there with PhDs fighting for jobs to want to do anything to give an independent scholar who has not osculated the correct glutei maximi and who has not got the correct string of abbreviations after his or her name, a place in the spectrum. She worked independently. She listened very carefully to what the acknowledged scholars had to say. If they were correct and she wasn't, she acknowledged it. If she felt they were incorrect, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And of course, acknowledged scholars don't like it when someone who isn't a member of the community discovers something that they'd overlooked. And of course, the classic example of that was when Rosalyn noticed that little embellishment that Sebastian Bach wrote into measure 17 of the Andante in the Italian concerto, and started to embellish that line. What the acknowledged scholars, the backing and filling that they did to try and make it look like they had realized this before she discovered it, was amusing to witness. And of course, the other aspect of it, which was great fun, was I worked with her on the preparation of her introduction for that published edition of the Italian concerto that she did as a result of that. And she decided, quite rightly, that the original print should be reproduced in the introduction. And I looked at the printed score that she had and noticed that there had been a correction made. And I showed her the differences. She looked at it and she said, "You know, I'd never noticed that." And of course, Rosalyn went to that original text, no longer accepting the quote-unquote corrections to make things symmetrical that generation after generation of scholars have made. As she said, don't ever forget that symmetry is not a Baroque concept. So, to the best of my knowledge, her last recording of the concerto according to the Italian taste, the so-called Italian concerto, is the only commercial recording with Bach's exact text observed, plus, of course, Rosalyn's marvelous embellishments. She was somebody who was, in a way, at the same time, behind her time and way ahead of it. And if the musical result did not satisfy her, she didn't care. I remember, with respect to the Chromatic Fantasia and Fugue, in the Chromatic Fantasia, the second of the opening flourishes has a piano indication under it in almost all the sources. She plays them both at essentially the same volume. I asked her why, and she said, "Because I don't like it piano the second time around." Absolutely, that's part of the compact between a composer and a performer, and it's something that Rosalyn understood very well. As far as posterity is concerned, people are already beginning to come around. I was talking with a very distinguished harpsichordist before the public today on the telephone, day before yesterday, Skip Sempe, whom you happen to know. And we were talking about how the younger generation of pianists is coming around to Landowska for Haydn and Mozart. And I said, yes, and Rosalyn Tureck for Johann Sebastian Bach. He said, most decidedly so. Rosalyn's approach, because of its sincerity and, if you will, lack of egocentricity, is timeless in a way that, and I know this will horrify people because I'm saying it, but I believe it, in a way that Glenn Gould's will not. Glenn Gould will sound very dated in 50 years. Rosalyn Tureck will sound timeless. You know, you asked, what is the first time you met Rosalyn Tureck? And what is, to me, an equally cogent question, because we never know when it's going to happen, when was the last time that you saw her? And there are two parts to this. First is the last time, what turned out to be the last time that she and I ever went out to have a meal together. It was in October of 2001, as I recall. She had just come back to New York. We met for lunch at Barbetta. It was a warm early October afternoon. So we ate in the garden. And I remember Rosalyn coming down the steps with a cane. It's the first time I ever saw her with a cane. And I said to her when she walked in, without the need of the cane, I said, "What are you doing with that cane?" She said, "Protection." And I said, "Rosalyn, the reason you have that cane is to swat people with it if they get in your way." She laughed. We went to the table. And I had with me something that was, if you will, a recent recognition of mine, which was what remains of the legendary lost portrait of Johann Sebastian Bach, the portrait that belonged to his pupil Kittel. And Rosalyn was very, very particular about images of Johann Sebastian Bach. And when Bill Buckley sent her a replica of the portrait in Erfurt that is supposed to show Johann Sebastian Bach as a young man, she sent it back with a note, as she told me, that read, "What? Bach with an aquiline nose?" Question mark. And of course, he did that painting as a forgery, by the way, which I've demonstrated. I took out the original of the Kittel portrait, which I happened to have at the time in my possession, thanks to the generosity of its owners. I showed it to her. She bonded with it instantly. And I had the camera. It's just a marvelous picture. And it's the last time I ate with her. But what is particularly touching for me personally is our piece, obviously, was the Goldberg variations. Aria, 30 variations, aria da capo. The first time I actually, quote unquote, met Rosalyn Tureck at Chagan Noor was to interview her. 2 days before what turned out to be her last birthday, I went up to the apartment in Riverdale to record another interview for which was to be converted into a print interview for Goldberg magazine. And of course, unfortunately, Goldberg went belly up. It would have been wonderful to have had that in there. That turned out to be the last time that I saw her. Because I called her several weeks later. It was the only time I ever heard fear in her voice. And she said, "Teri, I can't talk to you. I'm on the way to the doctor." Clunk. And I said, "Something is not right." And of course, the rest of it we all know. And that afternoon, when we did that interview, we finished the interview, and as I left, believing that she'd been born, by the way, on December 14th, 1914, not as we know now, a year earlier, I said, "Rosalyn, in 2 days, you will be 88. 1 year for every key on a Steinway. Now you go for the Russian extensions. As you know, a Russian piano has 92 keys." And she said, "No, dear." And then she did something which only she had the privilege of doing, tugged on my beard and said, "I'm going for an Imperial Bösendorfer, which has 100 keys. And sadly, it was not to be. But on that afternoon, December 12, 2002, I had no doubt that it would happen. Sadly, it didn't. but of course the recordings live on. What I would say is, Rosalyn, dear friend, thank you, thank you, thank you, because the gifts that you gave me keep on giving day in and day out. One of the things that she taught me that is an eternal gift is the fact that music is horizontal, not vertical. And too many performances nowadays, it's as though each measure, each beat in a measure, is being sliced off equally by one of those slices that they have in a delicatessen when you get the roast beef. And Rosalyn had the ability to convey this meaning. She taught me so much about how to respond to music. If she were to walk into this room at this moment, I'd get up, I'd give her a big hug and say, Rosalyn, thank you. It's a gift that keeps on giving. I was so lucky to have this wonderful woman take me into her life. Forgive me, I'm a little emotional, but that's, hey, she was a treasured friend and still is.